Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And today, we're really digging into a story that feels like it's straight out of like a gothic novel. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess.
Well, yeah.
I mean, come on, with a name like that. So you send over this incredible collection of articles and videos, and I gotta say, I'm hooked.
Yeah, it's one of those cases, isn't it, where it's not just the crimes themselves, but like you said, how this story became this legend that just sticks with you.
Totally. And that's what I'm so fascinated by, right? It's like separating the real person, the history from the myth that's built up around her. So before we get into like all the accusations and the really dark stuff, set the stage for us.
Sure, sure.
Who was Elizabeth Bathory? Where does this story even begin?
Well, we're talking about someone born in 1560
Hmm.
into, let's just say, serious privilege. I mean, her family tree, forget branches, this thing was a straight up royal canopy. Kings, princes, you name it, she was related.
Mm.
So right out the bat, you've got wealth, obviously, but also access to education, a level of power that most women, even noble women, could only dream of in that era.
See, that's what makes it so interesting to me. Like on paper, she had it all, right? So where did it all, I don't know, go wrong?
Right, right. And that's the question, isn't it? Because even with all that privilege, there are these hints of darkness even in her early life. The sources you sent, they suggest she was exposed to some pretty brutal stuff as a kid. Like violence was just part of life, among the nobility.
Was there anything specific or just sort of like the general atmosphere?
There are accounts, though, how accurate they are is debatable, but accounts of her seeing some pretty harsh punishments doled out, even participating in them, servants, how things were back then. So, yeah, I think the era itself, all the wars and unrest, it probably made some people, especially those in power, a little, shall we say, desensitized.
It's amazing how much our environment shapes us, right? I mean, even with every advantage in the world, if you're surrounded by that kind of darkness, how much does it stay with you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it leads us to another big piece of this, her marriage. 11 years old, just a kid, and she's betrothed to Frank Nadaski,
Yeah.
a count, powerful guy, known for being absolutely ruthless, especially in his military campaigns fighting the Ottomans.
11. Good grief. That's barely out of childhood. And married to this, like, hardened, brutal warrior. Talk about pressure.
Oh, absolutely. And remember, this wasn't just two people getting hitched. This was a major power move, uniting two of the most influential families in Hungary. The pressure on her must have been immense.
Plus, if he was off fighting all the time, which it sounds like he was, she's left holding the reins,
Right.
managing estates, dealing with who knows what kind of stuff, all while still basically a teenager herself.
Exactly. And while it's hard to say for sure, some scholars think this period, this trial by fire, really had a huge impact on her.
So you've got all this really potent mix brewing, right? The power, the violence she's already witnessed, and now she's in charge. I mean, it sounds like her life was a pressure cooker, right?
It was, and it's about to boil over. Because in 1604, Frank Nadaski dies. Bathory becomes a widow, still relatively young. And that's when those whispers we talked about, the rumors of cruelty,
Hmm.
that's when they really start to ramp up.
So we've got this potent mix of power, a changing social landscape, and a woman who has already had a front row seat to the darker side of nobility. What shape did these whispers of cruelty actually take? What was Bathory accused of doing?
Well, at first it was disappearances, mostly.
Yeah.
Servant girls, going missing from her estates.
Right.
And I mean, tragically, that wasn't all that unusual back then. Easy to explain away or just ignore, sadly. But then things escalated. The rumors got worse. Whispers of suspicious deaths, not just disappearances, starting to come from Bathory's castles. Multiple castles, actually.
Okay, so we've got vulnerable young women, whispers of something bad happening. Did the rumors get more specific than that?
Oh, yeah, they did. And this is where it gets really disturbing. See, the accusations, they went from suspicious deaths to, well, outright torture. Young women lured to the castles with promises of work, education, and then
Because you mentioned all those witness testimonies, hundreds of them, right, that were collected.
hundreds, yeah. And while we'll get into how reliable those actually were a bit later, they paint a pretty terrifying picture of what was allegedly happening behind those castle walls.
So what were they saying? Was there like a common thread in the testimonies?
There were definitely some recurring themes. The testimonies describe all sorts of things, needles, like driven under fingernails, girls stripped and left out in the freezing
Oh,
cold.
God.
Yeah. And then there were beatings, awful ones, that left some of these young women disfigured. And there were even accounts of Bathory herself biting her victims, drawing blood. It's all very,
Ritualistic, almost.
yeah, you got it. Which, of course, brings us to the elephant in the room, or rather the bloodbath in the castle.
Right. I mean, you can't talk about Elizabeth Bathory without mentioning the bloodbath, right? It's like her whole thing. This image of her obsessed with staying young, bathing in the blood of virgins to keep her beauty.
Gruesome stuff. And it's an image that's stuck big time. But you're about to point out that it's not actually backed up by the sources, am I right?
You know me too well. So, set the record straight. Bloodbath, fact or fiction?
It's a good story. Got to give that. But yeah, it's fiction. None of the primary sources, even the witness testimonies, not a single one mentions bloodbaths.
So where'd it come from? How did this whole thing become so central to the Bathory legend?
It's like a game of historical telephone, right?
Mm-hmm.
The story gets passed on, embellished a little with each retelling, and bam. A century or so after Bathory dies, the bloodbath appears in writing.
A century later, talk about unreliable narrator.
Right. Though it's not hard to see why it stuck. I mean, you have this powerful, beautiful woman already accused of horrible things. Add in a bloodbath. Plays right into those anxieties about women, about aging, about vampires, which were having a real moment in Europe right around then.
Yeah, Dracula and all that. It's
Yeah.
like her story became the perfect blank slate for all those fears to stick to. But even without the bloodbath, the accusations were terrifying. I mean, hundreds of victims, years of abuse. How did this go on for so long? And who could possibly hold someone like Bathory accountable? She was basically royalty herself, right?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, think about it. She was related to kings, for
Yeah.
crying out loud. Challenging her, for most people, would have been political suicide.
So what changed? How do you go from untouchable to, well, whatever happened to her?
Well, it seems even being born into that level of privilege doesn't make you completely immune to consequences. And in Bathory's case, the person who finally took her down was her own cousin, Georgi Thurzo.
Her own cousin. What made him turn against her?
It's messy, as you can imagine. I mean, it's not like he was just some distant relative. Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary at the time, basically the king's right-hand man, powerful guy. And he was getting pressure, lots of it, to do something about Bathory. These rumors were just too big to ignore.
So talk about stuck between a rock and a hard place. Family loyalty on one hand, duty, and let's be real, probably some ambition on the other.
Exactly. And it's important to note that by this point, the accusations against Bathory weren't just coming from, peasants and servants. She had started targeting the daughters of lower-ranking nobles, people who had a bit more pull and weren't afraid to use it.
And those complaints reached Thurzo.
They did. And to his credit, he seems to have actually listened. He launched a formal investigation, appointed officials to gather evidence, take those testimonies. And this wasn't some quick slapdash thing. They spent months on this.
So this was serious. Do we know if Thurzo tried to protect Bathory at all, given the family connection?
It's hard to say for sure. Some historians think he made a deal with her family. No public trial, which would have been a huge scandal for everyone, in exchange for, well, a quick and quiet resolution.
A cover-up.
Maybe. But regardless, Thurzo acted decisively. New Year's Eve, 1610, he shows up at Bathory's castle, Báthory, with a bunch of armed guards. And what they found there, well, let's just say it shocked a lot of people.
This is where it gets really gruesome, right? The discoveries at the castle.
Right. But before we get into all that, into the stuff that really fueled the legend, we have to talk about the other people involved. Because Bathory's name is the one everyone remembers. But she didn't act alone.
You're talking about the servants who were implicated, right?
Exactly. Their stories, they often get lost in the shadow of Bathory's, but they're important. We actually have names from the trial records. Dori Disappearances, Ilona Joel, Katerina Benica, Janos Ujvori. These people weren't just bystanders. They were active participants in what went on.
What do we know about them? What were their roles?
They were more than just servants. They were, well, enablers.
Mm-hmm.
Dorcha Semtes, for example, she was Bathory's maidservant, but also a close confidant. And according to the testimonies, she was directly involved in the torture, even helped lure some of the victims to the castle.
It's a pattern you see, isn't it, in these situations? The hierarchy, the twisted loyalty, where dissent is punished and going along with it, well...
It's rewarded, yeah. And the others, they played their parts too. Ilona Jo, she was a wet nurse, but she's also named in multiple testimonies as taking part in the torture. Then there's Janos Ujvori. He was a dwarf, a court jester, and he supposedly helped get rid of the bodies.
Oh, God.
And then there's Katerina Benica, another maidservant. Her role is interesting, though.
What do you mean?
Well, there's some evidence she might have actually been coerced, maybe even abused herself by the other servants. A reminder that within this system, even among the abusers, there were levels of power at play.
God, that's awful. But what happened to them? I mean, they were all caught up in this, so what was their fate?
Well, it's a pretty stark contrast to what happened to Bathory, sadly. Remember, she was nobility, practically untouchable.
Hmm.
But her servants, not so much. They were put on trial, and the punishments, they were brutal, even for that time.
How brutal are we talking?
Alona Jo and Dorothea Semtez, they were tortured. Their fingers were torn off with hot pincers before they were burned alive.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. János Húsváry, because he was young, they beheaded him, then threw his body on the pyre. It's a reminder of just how brutal the justice system was back then, and how differently the powerful and the powerless were treated.
And Bathory, what about her? What did Thurzo do once he got to Cesete?
Well, for Bathory, it seems like even with all this, her family's influence, it still carried some weight. She never actually stood trial for her crimes, like we talked about. Probably part of that deal Thurzo made to avoid, airing all the dirty laundry.
Right, right. So she escapes the full weight of the law. But what happened to her?
House arrest. In her own castle, Cesete. Though even here, the stories get a little murky. Some sources say she was confined to a single room, windows bricked up, doors sealed, just a small opening for food, air, that kind of thing.
Walled up in her own castle. That's harsh, even if it wasn't technically a formal punishment.
It definitely got people talking, that's for sure. And it still does. Makes you wonder, was it mercy, considering what could have happened to her, or a crueler kind of punishment, alone, shut away, for someone used to so much control? I mean, the sources don't really say.
Yeah, the psychological impact, it's hard to even wrap your head around it, to go from all that power, that privilege, to basically being entombed alive.
And that takes us to, I think, the core mystery of Elizabeth Bathory, the question that people still debate. Was she a monster? Like, truly sadistic, enjoyed inflicting pain?
Yeah.
Or, and I know this might sound crazy given everything we've discussed, but was she a victim herself?
A victim of what?
Well, a lot of historians, they point to the political realities of the time. Remember, this wasn't just any noblewoman. She was rich, powerful, controlled land, and she was a woman in a man's world. It's not a stretch to imagine she made some enemies along the way.
So she was a convenient scapegoat. Someone, or maybe a lot of someones, wanted her gone, and this was the way to do it.
It's possible. Some sources even mention debts. People who owed Bathory a lot of money they wouldn't have to pay if she was out of the picture. Plus, don't forget, after her arrest, her lands, her wealth, they were divided up pretty quickly by the people who, shall we say, benefited most from her downfall.
Wow. It's like something out of, well, I don't know, like a modern-day political thriller or something. You start to see these shadows, right? Make you question if the people who were so quick to call her a monster had their own agendas.
For sure. It's definitely something to think about. History, it's rarely clean-cut, right? There are always these layers, these whispers and rumors. And in Bathory's case, we can't discount the possibility that there are forces at play, people manipulating things for their own gain.
Like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the ones you do have might be from a different box altogether.
Exactly. And yet, even with all that ambiguity, all those gaps and contradictions, it's a story that just grabs hold of you. Why do you think that is? What is it about Elizabeth Bathory that still fascinates us?
It's the perfect storm, right? I mean, on the surface, you've got all the elements of a classic horror story. The castle, the rumors of these unspeakable acts, a beautiful, powerful woman at the center of it all. It's like irresistible to our brains.
Totally. And then there's the historical context, the way her story plays into these bigger anxieties, especially about women. Powerful women, women who break the rules, who don't fit neatly into the boxes they're supposed to.
Oh, for sure. And let's be real, we can't ignore the blood, right? I mean, whether the Bath thing is true or not, this image of a woman who maybe, possibly, took lives to preserve her own youth, her own beauty, it just hits on something primal, something unsettling even now.
Absolutely. Speaks to our fears about aging, about death. What lengths would we go to cheat it, to hold on to what we have? And I think, too, there's just this fascination with the unknown. We want answers, concrete proof, and with Bathory, even after all this time, we just don't have it.
Which, okay, full disclosure, that's kind of what drew me to this case in the first place. It's like the more we dig, the more we find out, the more questions pop up.
That's the beauty of history, though, right? It's not about neat answers. It's about the journey. Grappling with the fact that sometimes things are messy, complicated, and the past. Well, it's never really past, is it?
Nope. It's always there, lurking beneath the surface. And it makes you think about all the historical figures we tend to put in these boxes. Hero, villain, monster, saint. Elizabeth Bathory, she kind of breaks that mold, doesn't she?
She absolutely does. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here. A reminder that history, real history, it's rarely simple. It's full of gray areas, ambiguities, and sometimes the truth is a lot more complicated, a lot more uncomfortable than we'd like to admit.
I like that. It's something to keep in mind as we, move through the world, question what we think we know, who we think people are. So, to our listeners, I guess I'd ask, what about you? What stands out to you about Elizabeth Bathory? What questions are still swirling around in your head?
And if you were going to keep digging into this case, where would you start? For me, it's those women, the ones trapped in those castles. We hear their stories, but just barely. What did they see? What did they know?
Their voices deserve to be heard. So, yeah, if you're as hooked on the story as we are, don't stop digging. Read those sources, come to your own conclusions, and who knows, maybe you'll unearth a piece of the puzzle that's been missing all along. That's it for our deep dive this week. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.